previous episode wrapped up with a consideration of how, while individual monks made a vow of poverty, the monasteries that they were attached to had no such commitment. As a result, they tended to become quite wealthy and plush. Even new movements like Cluny and the Cistercians that began as attempts to avoid that trend, well, they just ended up repeating it. In the early 13th century, a Cistercian monk named Caesarius of Heisterbach described the cycle of monastic life. He said, quote, "Discipline begets abundance, and abundance, unless we take the utmost care, destroys discipline. Discipline in its fall pulls down abundance." Well, there were frequent calls for a return to the simplicity and poverty of the original apostles throughout the Middle Ages, but the popes tended to resist these calls. That changed with Innocent III. He was open to mild reform, just so long as it didn't weaken the authority of church hierarchy. A new movement arose for the reform of monasticism. Not only now would individual monks vow poverty, so would the orders that they belonged to. They were the mendicant orders of the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Now, the term mendicant comes from the Latin word mendicare. It means to beg. The mendicant orders relied on begging or almsgiving for their livelihood. Europe in the High Middle Ages, in which the mendicant orders began, saw a number of social, economic, and religious changes. Towns and cities were growing in size and population. They needed more pastoral care than, parish priests could provide. Traditional monasteries were really of no help, since the monks lived in isolated communities unto themselves. The mendicants helped local priests by making the world their monastery. They went wherever there was a need, and those needs were many. The Franciscans were founded by Francis of Assisi. They concentrated on preaching to ordinary Christians, seeking to renew basic spirit-led discipleship. The mission of the Dominicans was aimed at confronting heretics and aberrant ideas, of which there were plenty at that time. The Dominicans were approved by the Pope as an official church-sponsored movement in 1216. The Franciscans then received papal endorsement 7 years later. They quickly gained the respect of scholars, princes, and popes, along with high regard from the masses. Their fine early reputation unraveled in idleness, ignorance, and even infamy in their later history. At a time when the spirit of the Crusades was waning and heresies threatened orthodoxy, the Italian Francesco Bernardone and the Spaniard Dominic de Guzman united in reviving the spirit of the Western Church. They started monasticism really on a new path. They embodied Christian philanthropy. They were the sociological reformers of their age. The orders they birthed supplied the new universities and study of theology with, some of the brightest lights. But two temperaments could scarcely have differed more than the temperaments of Francis and Dominic. Dante described Francis as a flame, igniting the world with love. Dominic was a light, illuminating the world. Francis is the most unpretentious, gentle, and lovable of all the greats of monastic life. Dominic was, cold, systematic, and rather austere. Francis was greater than the order that sought to embody his ways. The Dominicans became greater than their master by taking his rules and building on them. When you think of Francis, see him mingling with people or maybe walking through a field barefoot so that his toes can feel the soil and the grass. Dominic, he belongs in a study surrounded by books or maybe in a court pleading a case. Francis's life work was to save souls. Dominic's was to defend the church. Francis has been celebrated for his humility and gentleness. Dominic was called, the hammer of heretics. The two leaders probably met at least 3 times. In 1217, they were both at Rome, and the Vatican proposed the union of the two orders into one organization. Dominic asked Francis for his cord, that rope that he used for a belt, bound himself with it, and saying that he desired that the two would be one. A year later, they again met at Francis's church in Assisi, and on the basis of what he saw there, Dominic decided that he would embrace mendicancy, which the Dominicans adopted in 1220. Then a year later, in 1221, Dominic and Francis again met at Rome, when a powerful cardinal tried to wrest control of the orders. Neither Francis nor Dominic really wanted to reform existing monastic orders. At first, Francis had no intention of founding an order. He simply wanted to start a more organic movement of Christians to transform the world. Both Dominic and Francis sought to return the church to the simplicity and dynamic of apostolic times. Their orders differed from the older monastic orders in several ways. First was their commitment to poverty. Dependence on charity was a primary commitment. Both forbade the possession of property. Not only did the individual monks pledge poverty, their entire order did as well. The second feature was their devotion to practical activity in society. Previous monks had fled for solitude to a monastery. The Black Friars, Dominicans, and the Gray Friars, Franciscans, gave themselves to the service of a needy world. Now that word friar, it comes from the Latin fratres, which means brothers. The Dominicans wore black habits, the Franciscans gray or brown, so thus their designation as the Black and Gray Friars. Their solitary contemplation was balanced by immersion in the marketplace. Unlike some of the previous orders, they weren't consumed with warring against their own flesh. They turned their attention to battling the effect of evil on the world. They preached to the common people. They relieved poverty. They listened to and sought to redress the complaints of the oppressed. A third characteristic of the orders was that lay brotherhoods developed. A third order, if you will. These are called tertiaries. Now, these were lay men and women who, while pursuing their usual vocations, were bound by oath to practice the virtues of the Christian life. Now, some of you might hear that and say, wait, isn't that what all followers in Christ are supposed to do? Follow Jesus while being employed as a mechanic or a student, salesman, engineer, school teacher, whatever. Well, indeed. But keep in mind that the doctrine of salvation by grace through faith and living the Christian life by the power of the Spirit, that had all been submerged under a lot of religious tradition that sent the message that the only people who could really please God were monks, nuns, and priests. Lay brotherhood was a way for someone to, in effect, say, my station in life doesn't allow me to live a cloistered life in a monastery or be a parish priest. But if I could, I would. While the official teaching of the church didn't come right out and say it, what was strongly implied was that most people were hopelessly sinful. But by giving offerings to their local church or monastery, the full-time religious guys could rack up a surplus of godliness that they could then draw on to cover them. Of course, their balance being tied to how much they gave to the church and monasteries. Now, as an aside, while that may sound absurd, don't many people, in fact, kind of repeat that error? Think of the husband who hopes that his believing wife is religious enough for both of them, or the teenager who assumes that his family's years of going to church will somehow reserve his or her spot in heaven, salvation on the family plan. Lay brotherhood was a way for commoners to say, yeah, I don't really buy all of that surrogate holiness thing. I think God wants me to follow him and not trust someone else's faith. A fourth feature was the monks' activity as teachers in universities. They recognized these new centers of education held a powerful influence and adapted themselves to the situation. While the Dominicans were quick to enter the universities, the Franciscans lagged. And they did because Francis, he had kind of resisted learning. He was a bit of an, anti-intellectual. And he was because he'd seen, way too much of the scholarship of priests who ignored the poor. And so he said things like, quote, knowledge puffs up, but charity edifies, unquote. And to a novice, he once said, quote, if you have a songbook, you'll want a prayer book. And if you have a prayer book, you'll want to sit on a chair like a prelate and say to your brothers, bring me my prayer book, unquote. To another, he said, quote, the time of tribulation will come when books will be useless and be thrown away, unquote. Now, while this was Francis's attitude towards academics, his successors among the Franciscans, they built schools and became sought-after professors in places like the University of Paris. The Dominicans led the way, though, and established themselves early at the seats of the two great continental universities, Paris and Bologna. They furnished the greatest of the academics. Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus, and Durandus, those were Dominicans. John of St. Giles, Alexander Hales, Adam Marsh, Bonaventura, Duns Scotus, Occam, and Roger Bacon, those were all Franciscans. Now, the fifth notable feature of the Mendicant orders was their quick approval by the Pope. The Franciscans and the Dominicans were the first monastic bodies to vow allegiance directly to him. No bishop, abbot, or general chapter intervened between their orders and the Pope. The two orders became the Pope's bodyguard, if you will, and proved themselves to be a bulwark of the papacy. The Pope had never had such organized support before. They helped him establish his authority over bishops, and wherever they went, which was everywhere in Europe, they made it their business to establish the principle of the Vatican's supremacy over princes and their realms. The Franciscans and Dominicans became the enforcement arm for, doctrinal orthodoxy. They excelled all others in hunting down and rooting out heretics. In southern France, they wiped out heresy with a river of blood. They were the leading instruments of the Inquisition. Torquemada was a Dominican. As early as 1232, Pope Gregory IX officially authorized the Dominicans to carry out the Inquisition. And in a move that had to send Francis spinning at top speed in his burial plot, the Franciscans demanded that the Pope grant them an equal share in the gruesome work. Under the lead of Duns Scotus, they became champions of the doctrine known as the Immaculate Conception of Mary. The rapid growth of the orders in number and influence was accompanied by a bitter rivalry. The disputes between them were so violent that in 1255, their generals had to call on their monks to stop fighting. Each order was constantly jealous that the other was enjoying more favor with the Pope than itself. It's sad to see how quickly the humility of Francis and the desire for truth in Dominic were set aside by the orders that they gave rise to. Because of the papal favor that they enjoyed, monks of both orders began to intrude into every parish and church, incurring the hostility of the clergy whose rights they usurped. They began doing specifically priestly services, things that monks were not authorized to do, like hearing confession, granting absolution, serving communion. Though they'd begun as reform movements, they eventually ended up delaying Reformation because they degenerated into obstinate obstructors of progress in both theology and, even civilization. From being the advocates of learning, they became props to ignorance. The virtue of poverty was just a veneer for a vulgar and indolent insolence. These changes set in long before the end of the 13th century, the very century that the Franciscans and Dominicans had had their birth. Bishops opposed them. The secular clergy complained about them. Universities ridiculed and denounced them for their mock piety and abundant vices. They were compared to the Pharisees and scribes. They were declaimed as hypocrites, and bishops were urged to purge them from their dioceses. Cardinals and princes repeatedly appealed to popes to end their intrusions into church affairs, but usually the popes were on the mendicant side. In the 15th century, one well-known teacher listed the four great persecutors of the church as tyrants, heretics, antichrist, and the mendicants. Now, all of this is a sorry come down from the lofty beginnings of their founders. And we're going to take the next couple of episodes to go into a bit more depth on these two leaders and the orders that they founded. But as we end this episode, I want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and let others know about Communio Sanctorum. Also to let you know that there are some other series that I've done here on the Into His Image YouTube channel. The Hone series, short lessons on leadership. We also have an adjunct series to Communio Sanctorum called Lessons on Church History, where I've taken some of my opinions about the lessons that we can learn from church history and spun them off into different episodes. Short takes are exactly that, very short reviews of current issues from a biblical worldview perspective. And soon I'm going to be releasing a series of studies, verse by verse study through the book of Genesis.